by this man. In the presence of God, they felt every time they were in his presence that they said, he is the Messiah. Our expectations have been wrong. Messiah is not a man of war. Messiah is Prince of Peace. Messiah is not a great general. The Messiah is a healer who brings us into a loving and healing relationship with God. And their opponents were basically saying, no, he's not the Messiah. He's not the Messiah. And it's blasphemy for you to say this. And so at one point in Acts, we're told that the disciples were seized by the Jewish authorities and put in jail. And they might not have gone out except there was oh, come on, man. There's a scripture which I just lost. I can't. I've been trying.
Wow. That's exciting.
Well, I'll summarize the scripture for you. There was a rabbi. Whose name was Gamaliel. And Gamaliel was the grandson of one of the most famous rabbis, Hillel. And you can see Hillel centers on college campuses all around, because Hillel was really, probably more than anyone else, the founder of Hillel was someone who agreed modern Judaism.
Hillel was someone who agreed with Jesus on many teachings. In fact, pretty much all of the sayings we have of Hillel are in lockstep with Jesus, except one. They had different ideas about divorce.
So this grandson,
who was considered a wise and important rabbi in his own right, stood up in front of the council.
I don't know how to start the slideshow, but you can do that.
Okay.
No, I don't think I can.
No, I don't think I can.
So basically,
Gamaliel stood up in front of the council and he said, we shouldn't persecute these people. We shouldn't have them killed. They're good people. They're following God as best they're able. And
maybe this idea of theirs is all messed up. Maybe it's not from God.
Idea of theirs is all messed up. Maybe it's not from God.
Then it will fail.
But if that's the case, then
but if it is from God,
disappear.
We don't want to find ourselves opposing.
We don't want to find ourselves opposing it. So
I think we should be lenient.
I think we should be lenient with them and let them go, because we don't want to run the risk that we are opposing something that God wants to have. Thank you. And so there it is. It's Acts, I think 4:33 to 39. And he says at the very end, keep away from these men and let them alone, because if this plan or undertaking is of human origin, it will fail. But if it is of God, you will not be able to overthrow them. In that case, you may even be found fighting against God. So instead of taking them out and stoning them to death, they let them off with a light beating and gave them a strict warning not to preach like that any longer.
Who is this saying? What is saying?
This was the Jewish, it's in the book of Acts. Yeah, the people who were prosecuting the disciples were the Jewish ruling authorities, the Jewish High Council, and the people defending them was a very important member of that council, a rabbi named Gamaliel. So this is a case of the Christians were in trouble with the Jews, but a wise and important Jewish leader stepped in to help them, and is very very fondly remembered by Christians for doing so. We'll skip now to the beginning of Islam. You can see we've got a couple of places on this map. There's Mecca, and Mecca is the city that Muslims you're supposed to make a pilgrimage to this city once in your lifetime. So Mecca is kind of the heart of the Islamic world. It's where the Kaaba is, which is a shrine around a meteoric stone, and it's considered a very sacred place. Well, when the first Muslims were in Mecca, they were still a small group, and they were persecuted at the hands of the Quraysh tribe, which I'm probably pronouncing incorrectly, who dominated life in the city. And at this point, the Arabian Peninsula was mostly polytheistic. There were many ancient gods, and this idea that was coming out that there is one God, and Muhammad is his prophet, and all the other gods are false gods. Well, that met with a similar reaction to what happened in the Roman Empire when Christianity started saying, no, there's only one God, and we're not going to make any offerings at the altars to Caesar and to Rome. So the Muslims were in danger. They were persecuted, and Muhammad said to them, why don't you go south? Because just across the Red Sea, there's a place called Aksum, or Askun. I think it goes by several spellings. And it's in the region that we now know as Ethiopia and Eritrea. Muhammad said, the king there will not tolerate injustice, and it is a friendly country. He didn't mention it, but it was also a Christian country. The Christians had been in Ethiopia and Eritrea for centuries at this point, and they had really established this as a bastion of Christianity within the mostly polytheistic Middle East. The Ashkenazites were Christians, but their king, who was called the Negus, welcomed the refugees. By the way, if you're a Star Trek fan, you may notice that there are a couple of Muslim words that are borrowed for some of their aliens. They've got this alien group called the Ferengi. Ferengi is an Arabic word for Frank or Frenchman, and it was a pretty common word used for any European during the Crusades. And the ruler of these Ferengi aliens is the Grand Negus. So I'm not quite sure why they did that, but there it is. The rulers of Mecca said, hey, you've got these Muslims living with you. They belong to us. Bring them back here because we want to punish them for their blasphemies. And the Negus said, no. Negus said that these were people of faith. Muslims had some things that he believed in as well. They honored Jesus as a prophet. They revered the Old Testament prophets and kings.
He noted that there were obviously differences between the two faiths, but he said these are faithful people.
Two faiths.
But they sought refuge from persecution here, and they're going to get
good
refuge from persecution.
And they sought persecution here.
So
there's a time early in the history of Islam when Christians came to their rescue. Not all modern Muslims or Christians remember that. Not all Christian monarchs were as broad-minded. This is a portrait of Ferdinand and Isabella. We know them because they underwrote a naval voyage. They sent 3 little ships out to the edge of the world, hoping for a short route to India.
1492 was also the year they expelled all Jews from Spain. This was
Here,
called the
they expelled all Jews.
and
A lot of Spain had been under the control of Muslims for a long time, and in the Reconquista, or the reconquest, the Muslim Christian forces had been able to drive out the Spanish Christian forces had been able to drive out the Muslims.
and they decided
that that wasn't quite enough, because
foreigner, especially one who
foreigner,
follows a different religion,
especially one who follows a different
is a
religion,
potential threat.
is a potential. So they decided that
they were going to
put all of the foreigners, the people they considered undesirable, because they didn't fit the Spanish Christian mold.
They were
They're going to drive them all out, and they established something you've probably heard of. It was an Inquisition, and because it was the first one controlled by a king and a queen rather than the Catholic authorities, it became known as the Spanish Inquisition. And they were basically there to persecute heresy. You weren't expecting that, were you? So the Inquisition began rounding up heretics. And if you were a Muslim, you were also a heretic. And if you were a Jew, you were also a heretic. And you had to undergo, and they used a lot of pressure, including torture, although being Christians, they limited it. It couldn't be torture that would mutilate your body, because that would just be wrong. So they used lesser tortures. They would ask people to make the auto de fe. The auto de fe literally means the act of faith. And the act of faith was to renounce your former religious affiliations and to proclaim that you were a Christian and were obedient to the church authorities and to the Christian king and queen of Spain. If you didn't make the if you made the auto de fe, you were allowed to stay. And there's something called crypto-Judaism, where Jews in Spain have continued being Jewish for a very long time in Christian Spain, so long that their descendants still by the 20th century, were still going through Jewish rituals, even though they weren't aware that they were Jews and didn't know what the rituals meant. This was just something that they were supposed to do, that their parents and their parents they just knew it was important. So what happened to was if you were arrested, you stood to lose your lands, your property, etc. And if you fled the country, you would lose everything. But most of the Jews chose to fled the country regardless. Their identity, their tradition was so important to them that they chose to take that risk rather than, and so here's a map of how they spread from there. Some eventually headed through Portugal and to America. Some went into France. Some sailed to Italy and there to Europe and the Middle East. Most ended out in these three countries at the bottom: Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. And when they got there, the Muslims said, "Oh, you were thrown out of Spain too? You are welcome here. This will be your safe haven against persecution." And I'm not saying things were perfect in Northern Africa. The Jews were still a minority and still considered secondary, and they had to pay there was a special tax. I forget what that's called, that non-Muslims have to pay in Muslim countries. But they were safe, they were protected, because their Muslim neighbors recognized their value and their humanity and responded in a compassionate way. And this one is not an interfaith thing at all, but I thought I'd bring it out because a lot of people know this about Jefferson and about early America. Freedom of religion, we're basically saying you can be any kind of Christian you want, but it doesn't really apply in the same way to others. Well, here's something that Thomas Jefferson said when he was a selectman in Virginia, and he's talking about the Virginia Constitution.
What is selectman?
As I understand it, does someone have a better answer?
Oh, I just think it's something like a legislator.
Yeah, it's a legislator. He was functioning effectively as a state senator. That's probably a pretty decent parallel to this day, but different terms were used back then. Is a departure from the plan of the Holy, inserting the word Christ so that it should read a departure from the plan of Jesus Christ. The insertion was rejected by a great majority in proof that they meant to comprehend within the mantle of its projection the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian and the Mahometan, the Hindu and infidel of every denomination. That probably even includes Congregationalists. So, I mean, Jefferson clearly had some ideas about preferences of his own, because all the rest of the people were infidels. But his understanding was that freedom of religion was designed to protect every religion, not just the religion of the majority. And that is one of the earliest statements about the principle of equal rights under the law for all people, regardless of religious creed, that we have in our history.
And depending on your interpretation, he was not a Christian.
Right, Jefferson.
Some people would assert he was not a Christian.
Right. Jefferson, yeah, it's interesting because those who claim that we're founded on Christian principles claim Jefferson as a Christian. Atheists claim him as an atheist. What he technically called himself a deist. And as a deist, he basically said, I believe in God. I believe God is like a clockmaker. God constructed the universe in all its complexity and wound it up and then stood back and let it run, never, ever interceding. He also had his own version of the New Testament. You can see it on display at Marcello. The Jefferson Bible is basically kind of a cut and paste job where he took a razor blade and he cut out all the supernatural sounding passages and all of the things he didn't like, but he left in all of the moral philosophy. He had two Bibles he was working with at least. So yeah, the Jefferson Bible, if you want to read what he thought were the good parts. Is that? The Jefferson Bible, yeah.
And in modern biblical scholarship, I mean, they were doing kind of the same thing at a sophisticated level.
Yes, a more sophisticated level.
I wondered, would the Jesus seminar be a good topic?
But back to the topic for today. Jews of Europe have suffered of And to try to heal. But really came to a head in the early 20th century with the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. Germany was in a terrible situation following and the Treaty of Versailles. The economy was in shambles, the national morale was down, and this guy who came to power said, well, I know what the problem is. The problem is we've got all these Jews in the country and they're making themselves rich while we suffer with poverty and they want to weaken our pure Aryan bloodline, and if we just get rid of all of them, all our problems will disappear. Jews were anti-Semitic traditions in both Christianity and Islam. This pushed it so far beyond the boundaries that Christians and Muslims rose to challenge it. In 1939, following the Nazi invasion of Poland, a lot of Polish Jews fled to Egypt. And if you remember that map that I showed you a few minutes ago, that was kind of reverse of a migration path. A number of Jews had come to Egypt from Spain and moved on to Poland from there. There had also been Jews who had been in Poland for a long time, but the Egyptian government welcomed these Jews. And even though throughout the Middle East, there was a fairly strong pro-Hitler sentiment. Pro-Hitler not because they believed in his ideas, but pro-Hitler because they at that time were dominated by European colonial powers, especially France and Great Britain. And the idea was, hey, if you're the enemy of my enemy, you must be my friend. But they spoke up against the Nazis and basically said, no, these Jews can have safe haven with us. We're not going to give them to you. In 1940, following the Nazi invasion of the Netherlands, many Dutch Christians hid Jews and helped them to escape to safer countries. The most famous example is probably a woman named Corrie Tenbum, and she wrote about her experiences in a book called The Hiding Place. There were many stories came out of the Netherlands. And the Scandinavian countries about the heroism of the common people who risked their own lives by hiding refugee Jews. Yes?
Rabbi Kahane, who was our co-minister, whatever.
Yeah. Part of Manhattan Beach Church. He had been in Poland during the war, and he was protected. He was kept safe by Christians in Poland. And so this is something that's, there are still people living had that experience. And it's something the Jews refer to the righteous among the nations, and have a memorial set up for all those people, the righteous they call them, Christians and others who protected Jews during the Holocaust years. Also in 1940, and this is a neat story that I didn't know about until very recently. Jews from North Africa in occupied France sought shelter at the Grand Mosque of Paris. This was a big, beautiful structure. It was fairly new, and the leaders of the mosque said, well, most of the Muslims in Paris were from North Africa. They were from Morocco and Tunisia and Algeria. And so they looked on the Jews who were there from countries as their neighbors. Yes, they're a different religion, but they're still our countrymen. They're still good people. We still care about them. And so they decided to give these people shelter in the mosque. And because the Nazis had an agreement with a lot of the Muslim governments where they weren't going to mess with the Muslims. And so the leaders of the mosque came up with this really ingenious idea. They said, we're going to make you fake Muslims. And so they forged papers that people could carry that showed that they were Muslims, not Jews, and saw that and often this was back in the backcountry away from the big cities, would take in and care for these Jewish refugees. Which I think is very similar to, if you've seen the story Lone Survivor, it's a real life account of an American Special Forces soldier who his unit were behind the lines on a mission in Afghanistan, and they were ambushed, and all of them were killed except for him. He made it to the home of an Afghan, and because of the code of hospitality, this man refused to give him to the Taliban fighters. And they obviously built a very deep friendship around that. But this code was so strong that the Muslims in the night were willing to fight the need, show compassion and welcome to these refugees. Now, in our age, the thing that has come to represent this this mutual idea of protection more than anything is circles. And you've probably seen this in the news sometimes where Christians or Jews or Muslims will gather around someone else, a group of people who are praying, a place of worship, and they'll hold hands and they'll literally use their bodies as a circle of protection. In this 2011 image, Egyptian Muslims are forming a protective circle around a Coptic Christian church during worship to keep them safe from mob violence, to keep them safe from terrorist attack. During the protests in Tahrir Square in Egypt, Christians, the Coptic Christians who live in Egypt, formed circles around protesting Muslims, because even if you're out there protesting for a better government, you've got to observe prayer times. And so you can see the Muslims would stop regularly and bow down towards Mecca. And when they did, rather than leave them vulnerable to any violence, the Christians would surround them and join hands. In 2013, as anti-Semitism in Europe was on the rise, these Muslims formed a protective ring around a synagogue in Oslo. In Nigeria and Cameroon, there's a violent terrorist group called Boko Haram, and they had a habit of coming in during Christian worship and attacking churches. They, although they're, I think, Muslim extremists, they also prayer. One of the funny things about terrorism is are victims of Islamic. It's used as a tool to outrage the population and to stir up sympathy from Muslims outside the country and to help radicalize. Came up with a for prayers on Friday and protect you. And in this very violent environment, the Christians would even bring weapons to protect. And then during worship, the Muslims would surround the church in the same way. They united against an evil that was threatening both of them. After the shooting of a Muslim in Quebec in 2018, all across the country, Christians and Jews gathered as a symbolic action of protection to surround mosques and to show that they were not willing to let their Muslim sisters and brothers be targeted and hurt. A year later, Canadian Muslims said, we want to return the gesture, and they gathered around churches and synagogues with the same protective gesture. There are other ways of supporting each other. They may not be as visible as circles, but they are certainly important. After the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, which is still very much in our memories, Muslims raised more than $150,000 for that community to cover. These guys are Shomrim, and if they look like ultra-Orthodox Jews in bulletproof vests, there's a reason for that. These people have neighborhood watches in the Jewish sections of London, and they patrol them to make sure nobody tags anti-Jewish graffiti on their property, nobody assaults or intimidates the Jewish citizens there. Well, there was a shooting. A British policeman, a London policeman, was shot by Muslim extremists, and there followed a surge of anti-Muslim violence. And the way they responded is they expanded their patrols so that they were also patrolling the Muslim neighborhoods, keeping them safe as well. Sometimes this happens in big ways and sometimes in small. This is actual footage of a woman confronting a man on a train. This man was berating a Jewish family and two young Jewish boys. They were dressed in the Orthodox and was very aggressively said they needed to become Christians. Muslim woman stood up and protected them. Man that he had known them like that. Like most bullies, he backed off. There is still misunderstanding, fear, and violence that can occur. For all of our history, faiths have reached out to each other, cared for each other as neighbors, and even risked their lives for their neighbors from a different. This is one of the best and truest ways of expressing the compassion and generosity of the God who speaks to us from our common ancestor, Abraham. I put together a short list, and I apologize. I think I printed some of these and forgot to pick them up this morning, but I will make them available in the church office. And I know these slides will be projected, but just to go down them briefly, the first book is Jefferson's Quran, Islam and the Founders, which is a book that deals with the specific ways that Muslim rights were talked about by the founding fathers. In Ishmael's House is a history of Jews in Muslim lands. It deals with struggles they had, but it also deals with amazing things like this that happen, with shows of compassion and care. Free Men, or Les Hommes Libres, which is a French movie, a recent French movie, subtitled in English. I think there might be a dubbed version also. I'm not sure about that. But it's a very good movie dramatizing the events around the Grand Mosque in Paris during the Nazi occupation. Recommended highly. And of all things, the Grand Mosque of Paris tells the same story as a children's book. The idea being that children are never too young to learn about this kind of thing and to begin to emulate that behavior. And finally, The Hiding Place by Corrie Tenbum, which tells about her experiences during the persecution of Jews and her work in helping to keep her neighbors safe.
It's also a movie.
I'd forgotten that.
Or something. And it's available on streaming because I watched part of it.
Well, we're fairly close to our time, but I wonder. Oh, you're welcome.
How did Jefferson know so much about Muslims?
Well, that I have to speculate a little bit about that, but I think many educated Europeans and Americans were aware of Islam in this period, and been aware of Islam for centuries in Europe before this, but as a rule, it was presented as just this.
But this is England, primarily. I mean, the settlers. Jefferson's time were very many Germanic or Spanish or French. I guess they were.
I honestly couldn't tell you how many Germans or French or Spanish. Spanish, I think, probably knew a fair amount because it's so close. My impression, and it's just an impression, is that the educated classes of Europe and North America had a lot of books available to them at the time. And of course, Jefferson probably had a little bit of direct exposure because there were quite a few Muslims in North America at that time. Many African Muslims had been brought over as slaves. And so there was, even though there was a strong effort by slave owners to convert their slaves to Christianity, there was also more familiarity from living very close. And Jefferson, of course, was a Southern planter and a slave owner. So he probably knew something about it from new African slaves. As I say, this is all speculation on my part. I think if you pick up the book, the Jefferson's Quran, you'll probably learn quite a bit about what he knew and how he knew it.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that Jefferson wrote Quran.
He didn't. This is a book that's written about Jefferson and about the relationships of Muslims and the founding fathers. It's one on the reading list. So.
Now, by the way, would you give me a copy and I will forward it to people that want of your presentation?
I'll do that, yes.
And I'll forward it to people. We're not taking attendance here. You have it? Okay.
So that he was, I mean, did Muslims come over in groups, you know, the United States? We have
Like waves of immigration?
like way back in the beginning of the country, you know, Jefferson's time.
Not that I know of. I mean, you know, those Africans who were Muslim, I suppose you could call that a wave, but kind of an involuntary one.
Okay, they were primarily slaves.
I think so, but I don't know that much about Muslim immigration. I do know in the 20th century, there have been several waves of Muslim immigration. There was a big wave of Muslim immigration following the overthrow of the Shah of Iran. A lot of Muslims and minority, religious minority Persian groups, Irani groups, came to this country because if you're not part of and many of these people ended out in the Rust Belt. And you know, right now, Flint, Michigan has, I believe, the second highest Muslim population in, I think, Dearborn? Yeah, it might be Dearborn. Yeah, I think you're right. I think it is Dearborn. Dearborn has an extremely large Muslim population. I think Paris is very large as well. Of the I think that would be a.
Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.